The US pilot who landed his crashing plane using only the wing. The miracle landing that defies physics. At 14,000 feet above the Pacific, Captain Mark Ellery thought he had seen every nightmare a pilot could face. Engine fires, bird strikes, electrical failures. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the moment the right half of his aircraft simply ripped away in mid-air. 1 second he was cruising through clean blue sky. The next, he was fighting a machine that no longer obeyed the laws of aerodynamics. Passengers screamed as the plane snapped into a violent roll. Loose bags spiraled through the cabin like shrapnel. And Mark? He wasn't thinking about heroism, or headlines, or glory. He was thinking about one thing only. How do you land a plane with only one wing? What happened in the next 7 minutes is something aviation schools still whisper about. Engineers still debate it, and veteran pilots still call it impossible. Because the maneuver Mark pulled off on that dying aircraft with alarms blaring, fuel leaking, and gravity trying to tear the jet from the sky shouldn't exist. Not in flight manuals, not in simulator training, not even in theory. This story isn't about luck. It isn't about Hollywood drama. It's about a pilot who made a decision no pilot is ever supposed to face and executed a landing that defied everything Newton ever wrote. So buckle up. This is the chapter where it all begins. The moment physics walked off the cockpit and pure human determination took the controls. And hey, if you're into real-life aviation miracles, forgotten history, and stories that make your jaw drop, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because the next 9 chapters, they only get crazier from here. The trouble started with a sound no pilot ever wants to hear. A metallic snap so sharp it cut through the cockpit like a gunshot. Captain Mark Ellery's instincts fired instantly. His eyes shot to the instruments. Everything looked normal for 3 seconds. Then the jet jerked hard to the right, as if an invisible giant had grabbed the wing and yanked it downward. The warning panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Roll authority failure. Hydraulic pressure critical. A stick vibrated in his hands, fighting him with a force that didn't match any textbook emergency. Mark didn't panic, but his pulse spiked. Something was seriously wrong. When he tilted his head left, he saw the first nightmare, a stream of metal fragments spiraling past the cockpit window like silver confetti. Then came the second, the sudden dip in altitude, sharp enough to make his stomach rise into his chest. The aircraft wasn't just losing control, it was losing its structure. Behind him, a flight attendant shouted, "Sir, the wing! Something's wrong with the wing!" Mark didn't need her to finish. He looked through the left side glass just in time to catch a horrifying flash. The right wing wasn't whole anymore. A large portion had torn away, shredding into the sky behind them. For most aircraft, that's the end. A missing wing means an unrecoverable spin, a death sentence. But Mark wasn't most pilots. With over 18,000 flight hours, he knew how aircraft behaved under stress. He knew how they stalled, how they rolled, how they spiraled. But he'd never, not once, trained for one-wing flight. No simulator offered that option. No manual gave instructions. The plane dropped another 100 feet. Passengers screamed. The cabin oxygen masks lurched down, dancing in empty air. The jet tilted harder to the right, pulling into a deadly corkscrew. Mark slammed the rudder. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. That's when he realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't fighting a damaged plane. He was fighting physics itself. And if he didn't find a way to rewrite the rules in the next few minutes, they were all going down. The jet was tipping past 40 degrees, skidding sideways through the sky like a wounded animal. Mark could feel the pressure pushing him into his seat, squeezing his ribs. Every instinct screamed, "Pull up, fight it, stabilize." But instinct wasn't enough anymore. He needed a plan, something so unconventional, so reckless, that no airline checklist would ever approve it. He took one breath, slow, controlled, the kind pilots practice so they can think clearly when the world is falling apart. His co-pilot, Ryan Walker, was gripping the yoke with both hands. "Mark, we're losing it. Hydraulics are gone. I can't get response on ailerons." "I know," Mark said, voice steady but low, "because we don't have a right wing anymore." Ryan froze. "What are you saying?" Mark pointed through the cockpit glass. A long shadow of shredded metal streamed behind them. Ryan's eyes widened, disbelief turning into terror. Losing control surfaces was bad. Losing power was worse. But losing half a wing? That wasn't survivable. Not for commercial jets. Not for fighter jets. Not for anything that flies. The plane dipped again, dragging the nose downward. Alarms wailed. Wind howled like a hurricane, battering the cockpit. Mark knew they were seconds from entering a full unrecoverable spin. And this, right here, was the moment he had to make a choice. But with no ailerons, no hydraulic stability, and asymmetrical lift, the aircraft would spiral into the ocean in under 2 minutes. Option 2. Do the unthinkable. Use the remaining wing like a giant air brake. Let physics pull the plane sideways, not fight it, and turn that motion into a controlled skid. A maneuver no pilot trains for. A maneuver no engineer signs off on. A maneuver that only works if every force lines up perfectly. Ryan shook his head. Mark, that's impossible. Mark stared straight ahead at the endless Pacific. Maybe, he said, but it's the only impossible thing we haven't tried yet. As the jet shuddered violently, the passengers praying behind them and gravity clawing for control, Mark made the decision that would define his life. He loosened his grip, shifted his hands, and prepared to fly the aircraft without flying it at all. The jet dropped another 500 feet before Mark felt the airflow shift across the remaining wing. It wasn't lift, not in the normal sense. It was more like a sideways pull, an uneven drag that tugged at the aircraft's frame. Most pilots would fight it. Mark did the opposite. He leaned into it. Ryan, ease off the yoke, Mark said, voice calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around them. Ryan blinked. Ease off? Mark, she's rolling. We're about to flip. That's why. Let it roll just enough for the left wing to catch air. If we fight it, we stall. If we stall, we die. It wasn't a motivational speech. It was physics. Brutal, unforgiving, but predictable when understood deeply enough. The aircraft began to tilt, sliding into a strange diagonal drift. Passengers felt the floor angle beneath their feet. Drinks spilled. Loose items rolled to the right side of the cabin. The plane wasn't flying anymore. It was gliding sideways. Ryan watched the gauges with panic tightening his features. We're losing altitude at 2,000 feet per minute. I know, Mark said, but if I can balance our drag against the body roll, we might be able to control the descent. Control was a generous word. Nothing about the situation was stable. Every shudder felt like the last. Every vibration felt like the moment the fuselage might tear in half. Yet somehow, by giving up traditional control, Mark was gaining a new kind of control, one the aircraft wasn't designed for, but one he could feel through the trembling steel. He adjusted the rudder gently. The plane responded barely, but it responded. The jet leveled just enough to stop the deadly corkscrew. Not enough to fly safely. Not enough to land normally, but enough to keep them in the air a little longer. Ryan exhaled shakily. Okay, we bought time. Now what? Mark scanned the horizon. The nearest airport was too far. Too much altitude lost. Too much structural failure. Too much uncertainty. But then he saw it. A thin stretch of abandoned military runway on a small atoll ahead, cracked, weather-beaten, never meant for commercial jets. But it was flat and long. And right now, it was their only shot. Mark pointed. There. That's where we're going. Ryan stared. You're going to land us like this? No, Mark said, gripping the trembling controls. I'm going to slide us down, using the wing like a brake. It was insane. Untrained. Unapproved. And it was the only thing keeping them alive. The ruined military runway came into view like a ghost from another era. A thin gray scar on an otherwise empty island. No tower, no lights, no emergency crews waiting. Just cracked concrete and patches of weeds breaking through the surface. A place the world had forgotten, but a place that suddenly held the fate of 18,400 people. Ryan squinted through the cockpit glass. Mark, that runway looks barely long enough for a C-130, let alone a commercial jet. It doesn't need to be long enough, Mark replied. It only needs to be there. The plane shuddered violently, dropping another 100 feet. The passengers felt the unmistakable tilt as the jet continued sliding sideways. People clutched armrests, held hands, whispered prayers. Some cried openly. Others stared straight ahead in shock, their minds unable to process what was happening. Mark didn't have the luxury of fear. His brain shifted into a level of focus most pilots never experience. A razor-sharp tunnel of awareness. Every sound, every vibration, every shift in wind pressure translated into decisions. He lowered the nose slightly. Not too much, not too fast. just enough to keep the remaining wing catching air and the descent from turning into a free fall. The radio was dead. No emergency call, no guidance, no permission to land. They were alone, just two pilots, a crippled aircraft. Ryan swallowed hard. At this angle, we're going to hit the runway sideways. I know, Mark said. We're not aiming for a landing. We're aiming for a controlled crash. Ryan blinked. Controlled crash? Worst kind of landing, Mark said, eyes locked on the runway. But the survivable kind? The altimeter ticked downward. 900 feet, 800. The island grew larger, the runway clearer. Mark aligned the aircraft in a diagonal approach, angling the remaining wing to catch the crosswind. It was a technique normally used in heavy crosswind landings, a trick where pilots tilt the plane slightly and crab toward the runway. Except Mark wasn't crabbing into the wind, he was crabbing into physics itself. Ryan whispered, "If we hit too hard, the landing gear will shear off." Mark nodded. "Then let's make sure it doesn't hit too hard." He steadied his breathing, loosened his shoulders, and for the first time since the disaster began, he said something meant for both of them. "Whatever happens, we finish this together." The island was seconds away, the runway was waiting, and gravity wasn't done fighting. At 600 feet, the jet felt less like an airplane and more like a wounded animal limping toward shelter. Every second brought a new jolt. Every gust of wind threatened to undo the fragile balance Mark had created. The cockpit vibrated so hard the panels buzzed like angry bees. Ryan gripped the side console. "Mark, we're coming in too fast." "I know," Mark said, voice firm. "If I slow her more, we lose lift and drop like a stone. We ride this speed all the way in." The aircraft groaned, metal flexing against stress levels far beyond anything it was rated for. The missing wing had thrown the center of gravity into chaos. The airframe was fighting, twisting, trying to obey physics that no longer applied. Mark didn't look at the screaming instruments anymore. They weren't built for this. Numbers meant nothing now. Only feel mattered. The subtle pull of the remaining wing, the vibration pitch, the way the nose wanted to dip, then rise, then dip again. He adjusted the rudder. A tiny movement. Barely an inch. The plane responded like a stubborn horse being guided by touch. It resisted, then grudgingly slid into a slightly straighter diagonal path. Just enough. Ryan forced a breath. Okay, we might actually have a shot." Mark didn't answer. He was already 3 steps ahead, mentally calculating the forward speed, the angle of descent, the sideways drift, the likely point of impact. The numbers didn't add up neatly. They weren't supposed to. But he found a narrow window, a razor-thin margin, where the plane might survive the first hit. Might. At 400 feet, the island snapped into full detail. Weathered runway, palm trees swaying, rusted fences, a landscape untouched by urgency, unaware that 104 souls were betting everything on its small stretch of concrete. A sudden gust slammed into the fuselage. The plane jerked right, violently. Ryan's hand shot forward. "We lost it," Mark countered instantly, banking the remaining wing into the wind, forcing the jet back into the glide. The motion wasn't clean. The nose swung. The jet dipped. But the correction held. The runway was almost beneath them now. Mark whispered to himself, not a prayer, not nerves, but a pilot's mantra. Feel the wind. Don't fight it. Dance with it. He lowered the nose another fraction. The altimeter numbers blurred in rapid descent. 300 feet. 200. Ryan stared at the ground rushing upward. "Mark, when do we flare?" Mark tightened his grip on the trembling controls. "We don't flare," he said. "We slide." The engines whined. The fuselage rattled. The runway raced toward them like fate on fast forward. And in that final stretch, those last precious seconds, Mark prepared to defy every rule of flight ever written. At 150 feet, the runway filled the cockpit windows like a fast-approaching wall. Most landings are a dance of precision, small corrections, gentle flares, smooth angles. This wasn't a dance. This was survival. Mark tightened every muscle in his arms as the jet bucked violently, fighting gravity and aerodynamics that no longer matched any rule book. "Brace," he said quietly. Ryan's eyes flicked to him, then back to the concrete rising fast. The aircraft was still moving sideways, the wind using the missing wing as leverage to twist the jet off its axis. Mark countered the motion with the rudder, not to straighten the plane, but to keep it angled just enough for the fuselage to absorb the impact instead of flipping. At 120 feet, the left wingtip skimmed dangerously low. At 100 feet, a gust nearly toppled them. At 80 feet, the jet dropped hard, too hard. Ryan shouted, "Pull up, pull up!" "I can't," Mark said. "If I pull up, we stall. Hold on." He did the unthinkable. He lowered the nose further, letting the front landing gear take the first hit. It was suicide in normal aviation. But this wasn't normal. They needed forward pressure to prevent an uncontrollable roll. The ground surged upward. Boom! The front landing gear slammed into the concrete with a force that shook the entire jet. Oxygen masks swung violently. Passengers screamed as the cabin rattled like a metal drum, being beaten by giants. But the gear didn't collapse. Not yet. Mark didn't celebrate. He pushed the remaining wing into the oncoming air, using drag like a brake. The plane skidded diagonally, tires screeching, rubber burning. The nose lifted slightly, just enough to keep the jet from digging into the ground and cartwheeling. A second impact hit as the main left gear touched down. Another boom, another violent shudder. The missing right gear area scraped the runway with a shower of sparks, grinding metal against concrete. Flames licked the underside of the fuselage. The plane veered left, then right, then left again. Ryan gripped the console. "We're going off the runway." "Not if I can help it," Mark growled. He used the throttle, not to accelerate, but to stabilize airflow over the remaining wing. A technique no pilot practices. A technique most would never dare try. The jet straightened, slightly, enough to hold a path. The runway sped beneath them, blurred by speed and smoke, screeching metal, tearing rubber, the whine of overstressed engines. The plane was no longer flying. It was surfing its way across concrete. The end of the runway loomed, trees, dirt, and destruction waiting beyond. Mark slammed the remaining engine into reverse thrust. The cabin jolted, the jet shook, the concrete smoked, and foot by foot, breath by breath, the impossible landing fought its way toward a stop. The jet screeched across the last third of the runway, leaving behind a trail of shredded rubber, twisted aluminum, and scorched concrete. Every second felt like an eternity. Mark kept reverse thrust engaged, fighting the sideways drift as the aircraft slid like a 1,000-ton hockey puck on asphalt. The trees at the end of the runway grew larger, closer, too close. Ryan's voice cracked. "We're out of runway." Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire being was focused on one thing: bleeding speed. Every vibration through the controls told him how much the fuselage could still endure. Every sound from below warned him how close they were to collapse. The right side of the jet screeched with sparks as bare metal carved a glowing line across the concrete. The remaining landing gear wobbled violently, threatening to snap. The cabin rattled so hard it seemed like the bolts holding it together might shake loose. Still, they slowed. 130 knots, 110, 90. The emergency lights flickered. Overhead panels clattered. A child somewhere in the back screamed for their mother. Another voice whispered a prayer. The plane was alive, barely but alive enough to keep sliding. "Come on, come on," Mark muttered through clenched teeth. The runway's final 30 yards approached. Beyond it, sand, bushes, and uneven terrain that would tear the fuselage apart. Mark made a split-second choice. He cut the remaining engine. The jet lurched forward, then dipped as the nose lost support. The skid slowed sharply. 70 knots, 60, 50. The front landing gear groaned and finally collapsed, slamming the nose into the runway with a bone-rattling thud. The cockpit jolted downward. Glass rattled. Warning alarms shrieked their final tones. But the collapse helped. The metal scraping against concrete acted like a brake. 40 knots, 30, 20. The end of the runway was just feet away now. Mark braced his left arm against the panel, preparing for the final jolt. The jet crossed the last few feet of concrete and slid into the sand beyond. The cabin jerked. A cloud of dust and grit burst upward, blinding the windows. The jet groaned one last time, then silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes when chaos suddenly dies. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ryan let out a shaking exhale. "Mark, we stopped." Mark didn't celebrate. His hands were still frozen on the dead controls, knuckles white, chest heaving as adrenaline finally spilled into his bloodstream. "Run emergency checklist," he said quietly, forcing himself back into pilot mode. "We're not done yet." Behind them, the cabin filled with low sobs. frantic whispers, and stunned disbelief. They had survived the impossible. Now Mark had one more mission: get every soul off that plane alive. For several seconds, the cockpit felt unreal, a place suspended between disaster and survival. Mark's ears rang, his hands trembled, his heartbeat thudded in his chest like he was still falling from the sky. But training took over before fear could. "Evac checklist," he said. Ryan snapped back into focus. Right, deploying slides. They moved with mechanical precision, even though adrenaline flooded every nerve. Ryan armed the doors. Mark cut electrical systems. Fire warnings blinked faintly across the panel, but none showed active flames. A miracle by itself. Then the first sound broke through the stunned silence. Crying. Not fear this time, relief. Mark unbuckled and kicked the cockpit door open. The cabin was chaos in slow motion. People were standing, shaking, hugging strangers. Others were frozen in their seats, unable to move after nearly 10 minutes of staring death in the face. A flight attendant spotted him. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. "Captain, the passengers are ready." Mark nodded. "Let's get them out." He raised his voice, commanding the whole cabin. "Everyone, leave your bags, head to the exits. Follow the crew. You're safe now. Go." The word safe hit the passengers like a shockwave. Some burst into tears. Others touched the walls of the plane as if thanking it for holding together. Mark guided a mother carrying her toddler, helped an elderly man who was shaking so hard he could barely walk, steadied a teenager whose legs buckled at the top of the escape slide. One by one, people rushed out into the bright island sun, barefoot, crying, laughing. Some collapsed to their knees the moment their feet hit the sand, overwhelmed by the realization of what they had survived. Through the open fuselage doors, Mark could see the plane clearly for the first time. The shredded wing, the torn metal belly, the scorched trail behind it. It looked like something that should have been found at the bottom of the ocean, but it wasn't. They weren't. When the last passenger touched the ground, a flight attendant whispered, "Captain." "That's all of them." Mark exhaled, the weight of the world leaving his chest. "Good, go. I'll be right behind you." He stepped out of the damaged jet, his boots sinking into warm sand. The wind brushed his face, calm, steady, peaceful. A cruel contrast to the nightmare they'd just survived. Ryan walked up beside him. "Mark, what you did up there, no one's ever done that." Mark didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about heroics, or miracles, or headlines. He was thinking about 184 people standing alive on a deserted island runway because for 7 minutes he refused to surrender to physics. He looked back at the aircraft, battered but intact. "That plane didn't want to fly," he said quietly, "but it wanted us to live." Rescue helicopters arrived 40 minutes later, long enough for the shock to settle, but not long enough for anyone to fully process what had happened. Passengers sat in small clusters on the sand, wrapped in emergency blankets handed out by the flight crew. Some stared at the ocean, others held hands and whispered about family they needed to call. A few simply cried, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming realization they were alive. Mark stood apart, near the plane he had somehow coaxed out of the sky. He studied it quietly, the shredded metal, the collapsed nose, the gutted wing. Engineers later would say that no aircraft with that level of structural failure should have remained airborne. Every expert would agree, losing that much wing at that altitude should have been fatal. But Mark didn't think about physics or odds. He thought about the faces that walked off the jet, the kids who would go home, the parents who would hug their families again, the people who had been given a second chance. Ryan approached, rubbing his shoulder. "They're asking for you," he said with a tired smile. "All of them," Mark sighed softly. "I didn't do anything they wouldn't have done." Ryan shook his head. "No, Mark. What you did, nobody trains for. Nobody expects. You kept your head when the sky fell apart." Before Mark could argue, the passengers began to gather around him, slowly at first, then in a wave. Some hugged him, others shook his hand. A woman pressed her forehead against his shoulder, whispering thank you again and again. A father lifted his daughter, a girl no older than 7, and she reached out to Mark with tiny arms. He froze for a moment, then lifted her into a gentle hug. Her voice was soft. "You saved us." Those 3 words broke whatever shield of calm he had left. His eyes burned, his chest tightened. For the first time since the wing tore away, Captain Mark Ellery allowed himself to feel the truth. He had done the impossible. Not because he was fearless, not because he was superhuman, but because when physics said no, he kept searching for the one way it might say maybe. When the rescue team finally moved everyone toward transport, Mark took one last look at the plane resting quietly in the sand, a machine that shouldn't have survived, a crew that refused to give up, passengers who walked away from a landing no textbook could ever teach, and a pilot who proved that sometimes the only thing stronger than gravity is determination. If you love true miracle aviation stories, hidden heroism, and real-life moments that defy the impossible, make sure you subscribe, because the next story is even wilder than this one.